Okay, first video in a while. I've had some changes to my schedule. I've started my new job just a month and a half in now. I was stuck on the awful first shift for a while. I was sleep deprived for the whole time of it. But they finally got me on second shift, so I can finally do videos again and have my nights back. Now, we all know that the AI knows us too well, and way too well. But there's not much talk on how it knows us so well. People just treat it like a black box and even hear that phrase, but it's really not hard to understand once you've learned a couple basic principles. It's not going to be coding or anything how this learns, because people make the assumption that computers and AI, you've heard the phrase machine learning. The implicit assumption in there is that machines learn differently from us, but I really think we're being arrogant when we think that way. And you'll see that we don't really learn all that differently than machines. It's just that we don't realize it, as some of these algorithms are evolved almost. So it first started to make sense how all of this works, how learning works, a couple years back when I was still in college. I didn't graduate college all that long ago, but this was a couple years back into college, if you get what I mean. I was doing NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. And yes, it is as complicated as it sounds to some extent, but I mean, once you're that deep into chemistry, it makes more sense. So actually, what they told us with how the machine works is you don't do just one scan when you hit scan on there. It actually does like 100 or 1,000 or whatever scans and averages them together to increase the signal-to-noise ratio. Because with just one actual scan, all you get is a bunch of noise, because the signal's too weak to come through the noise. But so what you do is you take 100 or 1,000, or the more scans, the better, really, and you average them together, because the noise is like a standard bell curve distribution, and then the signal is going to be that same distribution but shifted up from 0. So when you average all these scans together, the noise actually averages out to 0. The more scans you do, it gets closer and closer to 0 on average amplitude, but your signal starts to come through more and more. Eventually, once you do enough scans, you get to see it, and then it becomes more clear as you do more scans, and you can see fainter signals. Now, this AI does a similar thing when it can figure out something that you've never looked up or typed in or anything on whatever social media or website or whatever, but you've somehow typed in stuff that it could figure out that you probably did like it. So say, I'm just going to use two that have come to mind. So say I've never typed in anything related to metal casting or anything on whatever website. And we know they also share information, but let's just suppose for this example they didn't, because it'll make it easier to understand. So let's suppose it's, say, YouTube, and I've never typed in anything related to metal casting, but I've looked up a fair bit on, say, woodworking. So let's say 1% of the population likes metal casting, or looks up, watches content on YouTube from time to time on there at least. So then it can find out that of the population that is interested in woodworking, 3% also like metalworking. You see what I'm getting at? You have enough of these things that have a slightly higher chance above the background, and you stack them together, and then you can eventually find out, oh, it's like a 95% chance that this guy also likes metal casting, even though he hasn't looked it up before at all. And this is probably also how recommendations work to some extent when you think about it, because maybe I've never even done metal casting, but that same thing would also apply. I'm likely to enjoy it if I've done all these other things like woodworking, whatever. So the algorithm can figure out that I would probably like it if it suggested it to me. So that's kind of how learning works in its most basic form when you really think about it. Now, you notice I said like 95%. Now, when you see in scientific publications and stuff, not just on stuff like this, but on results or on anything really, they'll never say 100% certain or whatever. That's basically never said. You might have 99, 95% confidence, 99.9 even. They'll never say 100%, or they might give it in like it's known to like 5 sigma. That's 5 standard deviations that this result's known to, or whatever. So you notice it's kind of fuzzy how everything works. You can never know for certain. Skills like woodworking and metal casting, they're skills. People talk about like, oh, I just got a feeling that it won't split right if you do it that way. I don't know. I don't actually know that much about woodworking. I was just using that as an example. But metal casting, I do know a bit more. Metal casting, so like they would say, oh, if you carve out the gating system that way, that mold probably won't work. They can't exactly tell you why. They just have a feeling, a fuzzy feeling that it won't work if you do that. And you'll find out with a lot of these experienced people that they're usually right. They might not even know how at all, and in some cases they really don't know at all how they know, but they just do, just from seeing it often enough. And it's not like they're always 100% right, or that you can never do certain designs that they say probably won't work. I mean, they usually say probably, or so usually except for very obvious things. And even then, there's probably ways to get those to work some of the times. You get what I'm getting at? You see, that's what we're discovering with this is that we're not really learning all that differently than the AI. In fact, it's pretty similar how it works. It's just that we don't realize that that's actually how we're learning. And to add on to this, you'll commonly hear that, the visible spectrum is 400 to 700 nanometers, but then you'll see other definitions. But when you go and actually look up what it is, there is no cutoff where the red turns into infrared. It doesn't exist. It slowly bleeds from red into infrared, and you have this weird fuzzy region that, again, doesn't really have any defined edges, called the far red in between it, which is sort of infrared and sort of visible at the same time. But you almost will never hear this light even exists mentioned. Nobody will ever explain to you that the visible spectrum doesn't have any hard edges on it, that it kind of just fades in and out. And then when you get deep into the math, you find out that things can't really turn on and off instantly. Things can't change state instantly. Even though in pure theoretical sense they might be able to, in the real world it never works out that way when you consider all the other variables. So a square wave, this is going into mathematics, it switches instantly from, say, -1 to +1, and then it stays there for a period of time, and then it switches again for the same period of time, and then it switches again instantly. But a square wave in real life would require infinite bandwidth. Now, I know you don't need to understand what that is, but a square wave is an infinite sum of sine waves, of all the odd number sine waves, of the fundamental frequency and all the harmonics. So it would be one times the frequency of the square wave, that one's pretty obvious, then 3, then 5, then 7, and so on to infinity. So square waves in real life aren't perfect. They literally can't be. It's impossible. And this is really math trying to tell us something about the way the world actually works. In order to actually learn properly, you need to understand that this is how things actually work. And then the AI, with the stacking effects, how it can figure out that you might like something or that you do like something, just knowing that you like other things that have some overlap, just some slight more likelihood that somebody who likes woodworking is going to be into metal casting as well, above the average population probability. Another thing the AI can do is notice how traits cluster. Okay, so this kind of happens in real life to some extent too when you think about it, how traits cluster. Usually with materials, for instance, the harder something it is, the more likely it is to be brittle, and the more brittle it is. So that's just like a very simple example. With people you might have, and this seems likely, but I can't 100% prove it, but I'm sure if you did a poll it'd probably come out the way I'm saying. But okay, so people whose favorite season of the year is winter, probably also their favorite time of the day is night. I'd be willing to guess that, or it's at least more likely above the average population or whatever. If you pay attention, I'm sure you know this. This is kind of goes into how people perceive others and what how they're likely to act, what their attitude is. This kind of goes into stereotyping a bit too. The way someone's dressed, the way they cut their hair, all that. You kind of have, when you look at someone, you kind of have like a reaction, almost like a bias inside your head as to how they'll act or what their personality might be like even. And that's from exposure to people and noticing how certain things cluster, as certain traits tend to cluster. Again, the AI does this too. That's how it can figure people out. It's really not all that different to humans. And to add on to that, think about I know it seems obvious to us now that if you add tin to copper, it makes bronze, and bronze is stronger than either tin or copper, and it's also easier to work with, has a bit lower melting point. But I bet most of you don't even know. I do know what the usual ratios are for this, but I bet most of you don't know what the typical percentages of tin are and bronzes, and what the different types of bronzes are, like basic types or anything like that. But now imagine you're living several thousand years ago, when copper was still already hard enough to get, and you're learning that if you add this strange soft, low melting gray metal into your molten copper, that it sometimes makes it stronger, but sometimes it doesn't. But more often than does, it makes it stronger. Now, they didn't know what elements were back then, and the average person probably didn't see metal that often, so they probably wouldn't be able to distinguish by color, especially if it was all a bunch of gray metals. It could be tin, it could be lead, it could be zinc, and it could just boil, burn, give you metal fume fever. But the point is, someone who's barely ever seen metals, and probably they don't even know what elements are, and they just know that, if you add some soft, low-melting gray metal to this copper, sometimes it makes it stronger, and most of the times it makes it stronger, but sometimes it doesn't, because it turns out they wouldn't have had any way to know, because it turns out, it wasn't copper, wasn't tin that you added to the copper, it was lead. So, and then it gets even more complex. So again, going back to chemistry. Very early on, like in high school chemistry, you learn, there's three types of bonding. There's covalent, there's ionic, and there's metallic. And we're not really going to worry about metallic right now, because it's not really important for most things. So just remember covalent and ionic. And then you get up higher into chemistry, and they're we're talking about covalent character and ionic character. You see, bonds aren't really either 100% covalent or ionic. Usually they're a mix of the two, somewhere in between. Only in extreme cases can they be considered one or the other. And then you get to learning all these rules, and then it turns out, but then this specific reaction actually does it the opposite way, because reasons that you were going to teach you later on. And then there's a whole nother rule to explain the exceptions to that first rule. And then you see what I'm getting at. Learning is really a process of getting to know all these weird exceptions and how these certain rules bleed and overlap and affect each other. You see, when I was thinking of when I got into college and we started learning about how bonds aren't usually 100% covalent or ionic, but they're usually somewhere in the middle, although often leaning to one side or the other. I was thinking, so wait a minute, all these simple rules and stuff you told me a couple years ago were basically all lies, and it's all a bunch of weird fuzzy rules that overlap and fade and bleed into each other, that there's no real solid concrete rules to how this works 100% of the time? And another thing I would mention that's that's going back more to the AI. These AI drawing programs have come out that can now create images based on a prompt. But when you look at these, you notice that a lot of the details are fuzzy. Some of these you really don't want to look at for too often, but at a glance, they look like what they're supposed to. Well, I think if you ask me, I can't prove it technically, I guess, but I think that's when you have an image in your head, I think that's probably what it looks like. Although when you put pen to paper and all that, you can build on that. It's an iterative process, just like how the AI builds better images that look more convincing. They keep going over there and adding more details every cycle or whatever you want to call it. But our bare imaginations, I do think they look like some of those more primitive AI ones where only at a glance does it really look like what it's supposed to. And if you look any longer, sometimes it can look kind of horrifying even. I think that's really what our imaginations look like, and we really are being rather arrogant with thinking that our learning process is somehow above the machines that we created. And for some they call it having your brain wired differently or whatever, not being neurotypical. But okay, here's my fucking autism card. Okay, I can talk about this. So One thing that I particularly struggled with really early on in life was learning what the correct tone of voice was for a conversation. So it took me a while to get sarcasm, for instance. And at first, at first, you might think you might actually take someone seriously or not understand why that they're saying it that way. And then when you go to say something, you might accidentally go and use a sarcastic tone when it's inappropriate, and you don't realize that that's what that means, what the tone of voice conveys. It took me a while to get it. Obviously, that was mostly in elementary school. That was an issue. And sarcasm relies on and this is kind of related, but not really, but sarcasm relies on a common ground or understanding, but, this is obviously fuzzy too. You can't write a rule book of how to do sarcasm correctly. And what it takes a while to get about sarcasm is that, yes, it's contradictory, and that's really the whole point of it. But there's situations where sarcasm would be hard to understand, or it might be implied where it's actually not meant. If it's torrential downpour, and I'm standing outside with an umbrella, and the wind's fucking blowing it around, so I can barely keep myself from getting wet, and I'm standing at a bus stop or whatever, and I say, "Lovely weather we're having," you obviously know I fucking hate the weather, and I don't mean that seriously. I mean it sarcastically. But how about this other situation? If I were standing and we were having a huge downfall of snow, like we were going to get 3 feet in a day, and I'm standing out in my snow clothes and stuff, and I say, "Lovely weather we're having," you would think I was being sarcastic if you didn't know me, but I actually would not be being sarcastic in that weather. I'd be 100% genuine. You see, especially if you're kind of weird or something, some of these sarcasm might take a while to get. Because it relies on this common understanding of what normal is, but really, what the fuck is normal anyway? Normal will slip through your hands like sand the harder you try to grasp it. So, for instance, what's a normal sleep schedule? Because this is one that's bothered me a lot for the first month and a half of work, which finally I'm done with. But anyway, so what? Is it normal to just get up when the sun comes up and then go to bed when it's down, or go to bed sometime a bit after that? What, is it normal just to get up at 8 and then go to bed at, 10 or whatever? Because think about it. If everybody was asleep all at the same time, during the caveman, the tribal, whatever years, you get what I'm getting at, the fucking Stone Age. All the tribe would have to do is, let's just stay up and attack them at night. They'll all be asleep. Or what about the nocturnal predators? What are you going to do about that? What if there's nobody awake to tell anybody that there's a pack of fucking wolves out in front of the cave opening? So, it kind of makes sense and evolutionary to have a few stragglers that are up when nobody else is. So what if my normal sleep schedule is to not go to bed till 4 or 5 a.m. So I've stayed up and gone to bed at 7 and still got a perfectly full 7.5 hours of sleep. So what really is fucking normal? You tell me. Do you want everybody asleep all at the same time and awake all at the same time? Does it really make sense? Do you want nobody to be available or nobody to enjoy working the later shifts? Do you want no work to get done at night? And it's funny, the deeper you dig, the more you realize that there really is nothing truly solid in the universe. There's nothing that doesn't have fuzzy edges to it. Even so-called solid objects don't have sharp edges if you were able to zoom in far enough. Because the atoms themselves are made of the nuclei and electrons. The electrons, I'm sure you've heard, are actually wave particles, and they exist in a cloud of probability where you're more or less likely to find the electron. So the outside of the atoms isn't solid, and then the inside, those particles, the protons and neutrons, also have their own similar thing going on, wave-particle duality. And then the entirety of the atom, I think I heard it before, if an atom was the size of a football field, the nucleus would be the size of a pinhead in the center. So that's about what you're dealing with. So some people say the glass is half empty. Some people say the glass is half full. I say there is no glass. It's like that scene from The Matrix, there is no spoon. But when you really think about it, almost the entirety of the spoon is air, not even air, an empty space. The atoms and the protons, neutrons, and electrons that make up the spoon all exist in some fuzzy cloud of probability that you can only see it as a solid spoon once you zoom out far enough. So really there is no spoon. And I think one of the reasons why you see sometimes this popular, part of it is nostalgia, of course, but why the static aesthetic is so popular, to some people at least, is it almost reflects a fundamental truth of how our universe works. And I think going forward, as AI algorithms continue to be more and more important, we should keep this in mind. Well, that's all for today. This video is probably a fucking mess, but oh well. You're listening to WFUK LP, the only radio that